Bill Gates, formerly the world's richest man, has accused Elon Musk, the world's current richest man, of killing millions of children. He's given this quote to the Financial Times. The picture of the world's richest man killing the world's poorest children is not a pretty one. Bill Gates expanded on the criticism in an interview for the New York Times. This was his response to a question about the Trump administration cutting foreign aid. So he said, "Over the last 25 years, we achieved far more than I, or I think anyone, expected. The world invented new tools. We made them cheap. We got them out. We went from 10 million childhood deaths to 5 million. Over the next 20 years, can you cut that in half again? The answer is absolutely. But then you have this weird thing. In the next 4 years or 8 years, I don't know, the actual money going into these causes is reduced, and reduced way beyond what I would have expected. On childhood deaths, which over the next few years should have gone from 5 million to 4 million, now, unless there's a big reversal, will probably go from 5 million to 6 million. Bill Gates in the interview is very, very critical of especially the decisions to sort of roll back funding for HIV medicine. Asked about Elon Musk specifically in the New York Times interview, Gates said this: he's the one who cut the USAID budget. He put it in the wood chipper. The world's richest man has been involved in the deaths of the world's poorest children. Bill Gates was speaking to the press in the context of his decision to wind down his Gates Foundation in the next 20 years. And the interview in the New York Times was conducted by David Wallace Wells, brilliant journalist. We've had him on before. And I caught up with David earlier to get more details on Gates' thinking, his dispute with Elon Musk, and his philanthropic legacy. I began our conversation by asking David about the significance of Bill Gates' decision to wind down the Gates Foundation.
I think there are a lot of ways to look at it. I mean, in the short term, it means that they're going to be giving actually a lot more money to the causes that they've been giving to for the last couple of decades over the next couple of decades. And you can kind of see this as a response to the crisis of foreign aid in the world today. You know, if you've got the money and you want to give it away anyway, why not, deliver it when it counts as opposed to when things are more flush. But I think it also marks a kind of generational cultural shift in the culture of billionaire philanthropy and foreign aid more generally. Gates to me is a kind of representative, maybe even more than anyone else on the world stage, aside from, Obama, of this long era, the end of history, the age of globalization, the age of neoliberalism, in which we were sort of counting the failures of the major capitalist systems in delivering real gains to the world's poor, but also were, glad that some people were kind of picking up the slack and doing some of the, the back end work to make that less egregious, the failures of that system less egregious. And, the Gates legacy is complicated. There are failures there. They've acknowledged some of them and have not acknowledged others, but just the impulse that he and his foundation exhibit, I think, is at this point, increasingly, it looks like a relic of an earlier era. We just don't see oligarchs like him. We don't see the world's richest people donating literally all of their fortunes to the needs of the world's poor. And for all the, problems of the Gates approach, I think that's a real loss.
Yeah, I mean, there was an image sort of in the interview of Bill Gates with Bill Clinton, and it just made me think that sort of you've got these two sort of images of the old American elite, or the now old American elite, which sort of painted itself as being sort of rational, paternalistic, universalist, and then the obvious sort of comparison, the obvious mirror of them now is Trump and Elon Musk, and I suppose the difference couldn't be more stark. And I suppose I don't want to idealize the Gates Clinton era either, because sort of the unipolar moment wasn't necessarily, brilliant for everyone, but they put forward such a different image. I mean, how are you interpreting sort of that shift in how the American elite presents itself?
What worries me most is actually that it's not just a matter of the American elite, that we're seeing globally a sort of retreat into mercenary self-interest and narrowly defined goals and much less concern for fellow humans in terms of immigration, but also in terms of foreign aid. Gates points out to me in the interview, he's totally right that it's, you see aid budgets being cut all around the world. And, there's some reasons for that. The budgets are squeezed at the moment for a variety of reasons. And, as always, like foreign aid is like the least popular thing, so it's easy to put it on the chopping block. But I do think, after in the long aftermath of the financial crisis and then the sort of shorter aftermath of COVID, we're just seeing much more selfishness, and that is not good. It is especially grotesque among the richest Americans because, in part, because their fortunes are so great, and because it, at the moment, is aligned with this political project in power in the White House. That is, kind of not just like not humanitarian, but kind of anti-humanitarian, that sees any gesture of solidarity or sympathy for those weak or impoverished or vulnerable anywhere in the world as a performance of one's own weakness, and therefore worth dismissing. And I think what's funny is you mentioned Clinton and Gates, and one of the words that people would have used to describe their worldview would have been like futurist, and yet they seem to actually have been, in the end, throwback figures. Maybe to some, again, blinkered, myopic, deluded, but nevertheless, high-minded American ideals about the way that the rich and powerful could perform in the world. And it turns out that that set of values was already kind of expiring a decade or so ago, and now we're seeing it really immolated by the world's most powerful and richest people. And so, I don't think we're heading into a good time here, and I think that it's quite bleak and quite scary the world over.
Sort of specifically on development, because that's what you were discussing with Gates a lot. There is sort of another way of looking at it, which is sort of the era of Gates, Clinton. You had this unipolar power of the United States, and the image of development was something that sort of Western rich white men did to sort of lend a hand to the global South. Whereas now, sort of 20 years on, you can say actually developments in development have been fairly positive, because you've got the rise of China. It's less about Western nations sort of giving charitable donations to the global South, but countries in Africa can play off China and America against each other. People might think that these great powers are now being more honest about their real motivations, which were for sort of personal aggrandizement or geostrategic advantage. But people might look at the world now and say it's more honest, and actually the global poor have more leverage than they did when they had to sort of beg Gates for any help they might have needed.
I think that is in some meaningful way true, and I think that there is a reason to think on the human development side of things as on the geopolitics side of things, that the new arrangements of power on the world stage may provide some new opportunities for the countries that are kind of struggling the most. When I look back on these last few decades and try to put them in context, I mean, it is a kind of a complicated story. Sort of simplistic optimists will often point to these really huge gains in the number of people lifted out of extreme poverty since 1990, and it is quite astonishing, hundreds of millions of people. But almost all of that what took place actually in China. All of those gains were, not all of them, but maybe 500 of the 700 million people pulled out of extreme poverty were pulled out of extreme poverty in China. And that level of extreme poverty is just a couple of dollars a day, at a time when the world's relatively well off and extremely well off were gaining much more rapid clip, which means that the gap between the world's richest and the world's poorest was actually growing even over this period that we think of as a developmental miracle. And the developmental miracle was so profoundly in China, and to some lesser extent in South Asia. When you look at sub-Saharan Africa, which has been the focus of a lot of developmental hand-wringing and attention and for decades, there are a lot of ways to look at the state of things there where lives have not meaningfully improved over the course of many decades now. On some health metrics, things are better, education better, but in terms of actual earning power, the continent as a whole is really, really stuck. And it's perfectly reasonable to look back on the last few decades, the last 50 years of Western aid to those countries and say, are we sure that this was worth doing? Are we sure that it helped as opposed to hurt? Could it have crowded out, innovation, not just in the kind of private enterprise sense, but innovation in the governance sense, in the civil society sense? Is it possible that these institutions directly, like the Gates Foundation, but also those that they were supporting, blocked adaptation and resilience efforts by people on the ground. And I think it's possible. But on some, very basic fundamental level, it's like I can't get to a place where, U.S. cutting USAID and cutting PEPFAR and cutting vaccination programs and exposing all of these kids who won't be able to get vaccinations or medication against deadly diseases. I can't get to a place where I think that that's a good thing. And so the idea of the Gates Foundation withdrawing money in the same way, it's hard for me to really believe that that's good. I may be shown to be a naive American 20 years from now when it turns out that it's actually better for us to just get out of the way. But when I count the number of people whose vaccinations are the direct result of this giving, that's just a lot of lives that are going to be made more vulnerable unless we can sort of get over the hump of some of these global health challenges between now and the time that funding ultimately dries up.
I think you spent 2 days with Gates, or at least sort of the interview was over 2 days. Now, from what you've said and from the interview and from what I know about Bill Gates already, there's obviously a lot to say about the guy, which is impressive. Puts lots of funding into climate change, puts funding into global health. He is the kind of, he likes to put forward an image of being this sort of rational, benevolent, elite. But there is, there's clearly some truth to it. Also, I suppose there are lots of things you can point to about Bill Gates where you can say, well, that global order that broke down, you had something to do with it. And it was potentially because of, I suppose, your lack of self-awareness, your arrogance. And obviously, above all, you can think of Jeffrey Epstein, sort of what symbolized the sort of brokenness of that system, that world order, more than Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, and Jeffrey Epstein in a private jet, sort of putting themselves forward as the world's saviors. And I suppose, did you get an element of sort of reflection or regret from Bill Gates, not necessarily about Epstein, but just sort of in general about whether that set of liberal elites got a little bit high off their own supply to some degree?
Not in this conversation. I've met him a few times and talked to him at a few different points over the years. And, his line in general about Epstein, which I'm not sure really how much to trust, I don't know enough to verify it independently, has been that he was, trying to reach people who might donate to the foundation, and Epstein was well connected, and his relationships or his interactions with Epstein were limited to that. Again, I don't know how much to trust that precisely. It does seem, according to tabloid reporting, that his relationship with Epstein was one reason that he and his wife broke up. And I do think that that's part of the story behind the Gates Foundation changing course and ultimately sunsetting too, is that Melinda left a few years ago and is starting her own thing, brought a bunch of money with her. On the broader question of sort of the hubris of the liberal elite in this era, again, it wasn't something exactly that we talked about this time, except in as much as it was, we were focusing on whether the philanthropic projects backed by the Gates Foundation had delivered the gains that they had hoped, and why in the places we could see that they didn't, why that had failed. But we've talked at other points in the past about some of these bigger questions, and I think his basic perspective, which he's probably spoken about at more length in other forums, is that the system isn't perfect, to be sure. I mean, he says very explicitly, like, I don't really think I deserve to have this gigantic fortune, and for me the question is what should I do with it now that I have it? And he said elsewhere also, I think people like me should be taxed quite a bit more, and I don't want to present him as a pure force for good in the world. But I think that if, the question ultimately is like, are we thinking of him as a symptom of a broken system, in which case he's doing quite a lot to try to make up for the failures of that system? Or do we think of him as an architect of that system, in which case maybe you can never do enough to make up for it? And, I think I would personally come down more on the first side of things. But I think that the whole project here illustrates the imperfections of even the system, which now in the Trump era, we're looking back somewhat nostalgically towards, wishing for some more amount of humanitarian feeling among the world's rich. And I just to put a clear point on that, when you think about what the world's richest people are doing with their money now, Gates just announced with this announcement, he's going to give 99% of his fortune to helping, promote global health in the global south. Now, whether the Gates Foundation is the absolute ideal way to spend that $100 billion is up for debate. I think there are genuine questions about that. But if you are someone with a $100 billion fortune, it's hard to argue with that as like a gesture of goodwill, especially when you're comparing it to Elon Musk, who thinks his main job on this planet is to, you know, create a bigger footprint of his own, to redefine global politics around his own impulses, and ultimately to get some select few humans off of this planet and begin making a multiplanetary species in some really grandiose vision of long-term human history, which gives Elon Musk himself a central role in that drama. And that's not just true of Elon. He's the most grotesque of these figures, but it's like, what is Jeff Bezos' philanthropic giving about? When you just go down the list, it's like none of these people are actually focused on the material needs of the world's poor. And that is really, I think, quite ugly. Gates talks about the golden rule, but I also think about, Peter Singer's, thought experiment about, saving someone drowning in the pond. And, it's like, here he is, he's somebody who's thought that basically his responsibility towards the world's poor is as someone who's walking past a dying child in a pond. And Elon is someone who is not just ignoring that thought experiment. He's literally taking money away from kids who are going to be exposed to deadly illnesses. For what purpose? To like rid the American government of radical Marxist ideology. And this is language that Trump advisors have applied to the Gates Foundation too, calling it like essentially radical woke enterprise. When again, it's not a perfect organization. They have blind spots. They've made mistakes. They've made errors, and they've had plenty of failures. But they're still channeling a ton of money towards like vaccination programs in countries that couldn't otherwise vaccinate children. It's just like it's for me, it's sub-political. And to treat it as essentially an ideological gesture that needs eradicating from DC by Doge is just such an ugly impulse.
Finally, I mean, it is the sort of statements that Gates has made about Elon Musk in your interview and then also in the Financial Times, which has sort of made the most buzz. Is there a background of personal animosity between them that I wasn't aware of, or is this sort of purely that Bill Gates has just seen what Elon Musk has done in Doge and is sort of disgusted by it?
My understanding is that it's quite recent and has to do with, the last year or so of his political behavior, and in particular his animosity for foreign aid. I mean, I was talking to the Gates Foundation about this plan back in June. So this is this is not a direct response to Trump cuts. And I think they were genuinely caught flat-footed by how intense those cuts were. He says that in the interview, but I don't think he's misleading. It's for someone who cares about these issues, you want to think, okay, we're going to go from one kind of an administration to another. They have a slightly different set of priorities. They have a slightly different set of impulses. But, just the idea that this whole enterprise of helping the world's poor is going to be targeted, not just, because they're like really serious about budget cuts, but like targeted on day one as like the first action, the first aggressive action of the new administration, I think is really quite ugly and horrifying. And I think he probably also understands something of the story or sees the story in something in the same terms that I was laying out earlier, which is that, Bill Gates was the world's richest man in 2000 when he founded the Gates Foundation. He was, for a long period of time there, the world's richest man. He was trying to do something, in part for legacy reasons, in part for ego reasons, but also to some degree generous, out of the goodness of his heart and for the sake of the people who needed the aid. He was trying to use that money in a certain way. And he's seeing some real shift in the winds here that is not just unfortunate, tragic for the people who need aid in the poorest and least stable parts of the world, but also a kind of a rejection and a repudiation of everything that he has stood for and everything that he's tried to build. And, I think he sees there's some battle going on for the course of history and the trajectory of human development. And he thinks it's offensive on many, many levels that Elon has taken the steering wheel and is kind of driving the world forward in a way that, and in a direct way that Gates actually never was able to.